Thank you for joining us here at the Benton. My name is Victoria Sancho-Lobos, and I'm the director of the Benton Museum of Art and a member of the faculty here at Pomona College in the Art History Department. And I'm just so pleased to be here on this important occasion. We are offering this program as part of a series that we've organized in the context of one of our current exhibitions, which I hope you all have seen or will have a chance to see. Continuity, Cahuilla Basket Weavers and their Legacies. And we've been led in this critical project by our guest curator and colleague and friend, Meranda Roberts, who's here facilitating our program. And we're just really pleased that our institution has had the opportunity to present this important exhibition and follow this process designed by Meranda with us. Some of you may not know that the Benton is the current home for more than 4,000 traditional Native American items that came to us, in some cases, 90 years or 100 years ago. And so these are the foundational items in our collection. And for many years, they haven't had the opportunity to be so rigorously interpreted and reunited with tribal communities in a way that we have been able to do in the course of this project. And so it's important for us not only to acknowledge that our museum and our programs occupy unceded Indigenous land, but also to articulate what we're trying to do as stewards of this vital cultural tradition and partners with contemporary Native artists and culture bearers. So we are delighted that tonight's program can help point the way for us in the work that remains for us to do, which is considerable. We have a long way to go, and I'm glad that what we have been doing in the context of this exhibition represents a new start for us as we are also here in a new building and looking to start a new chapter of partnership with tribal communities and contemporary Native artists such as our speaker here tonight. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Meranda Roberts. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I don't have very many remarks made. Instead, I just wanted to just bring attention to who Weshoyot Alvitre is. She's a Tongva and Scottish artist who I have been honored to be a friend with for a number of years now and work on a number of projects with. And when it came to curating Cahuilla Basket Weavers and their Legacies, one thing that I kept going back and forth was how do we have a land acknowledgement inside of an exhibition? One thing about me is I hate land acknowledgements, at least written ones, in the way that we're supposed to do them. So instead, I asked Weshoyot what did she think about creating a map that kind of encompassed the landscape, but in more of a general way, like yes, from a Tongva perspective, but also looking at it from a wider perspective of Southern California, considering that the baskets are coming from the Coachella Valley. And what she produced for us is beyond amazing. I won't go too far into that, but I do hope that you take time to really sit with the piece, look at it, and read the label to understand that even if you don't fully understand what you're looking at, that's okay. Not all of the stories that Native people create are for you, or that are said are for everybody. And so there's things that only tribal members are going to be able to understand, and there's only be things that maybe non-natives understand, but either way, it's a story of creation, and the title itself is called The Original Instructions, which I just love and adore, so I will pass it off to Weshoyot now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming tonight. I really do appreciate you spending some time here, and I hope you will all walk through the exhibition afterwards, because it is a really, really special exhibition, and I think one that is really going to be at the forefront of the way that people display Native objects in the future, and also incorporate communities. So the piece that I was asked to do was a map. and also sort of a land acknowledgement. And both of those things are so sort of a Western concept and not necessarily in line with our traditional knowledge or our traditional ways of using landscapes. And so I sat with this a long time, and I had some like art projects that I had been working on independently just off onto the side, and I decided to sort of ask Meranda if one of them that I had sort of been, peddling with might work for this. I wanted to encompass the tribal groups in Southern California and not just focus on the Tongva Gabrielino, because the rest of the exhibition really focuses on the artistry of the Cahuilla. I believe there might even be some Serrano, and if they're not in the show, they're also like being housed at this museum. And they also have baskets here that we don't have information about. And so with that being lost, it's still important for us to sort of recognize those things and represent those things. Okay, so basically my sort of conundrum was dealing with sort of a Western viewpoint on map making and representation and Indigenous viewpoint. So Western colonial views on land and borders. We all know that Americans and colonial states like to map things on paper or map things to show delineations of material wealth, material value, and they don't take into consideration the things that are already there on those landscapes. Whereas the relationship Indigenous people have with landscapes is entirely different. There's a reciprocity between what the land gives us and what we give back to the land, and it's been that way for thousands upon thousands of years here in Southern California. We don't draw border lines. Many of the sort of edges of tribal communities are intermingled, they're intermarried. So we don't have strict borders between Tongva and Cahuilla or Tongva and Fernandino or, Luiseño or any of the other tribal groups in Southern California. It was sort of like an ebb and flow into these tribal communities based on intermarriages, based on food trade, based on a lot of different things. Historically, I started looking at maps of Southern California to see what was available as far as topographic maps in regards to sort of cityscapes and county lines and all of these things. First, Mexico came in and colonized traditional homelands of Native people through the mission system. After that, it was US occupation. And over those 250 years, we have diseño maps, which were drawn out by Spanish. And those maps actually sort of incorporate landscape to a small degree, where they include tree markers or river markers or large stones, things that were on the landscapes that they could identify. But it always sort of forgot the people in those landscapes. It forgot the sort of the plant relationships. And as I was doing sort of research into these maps, I got into topography and fault line maps, which are all sort of interesting. There's also maps that you can find that trace waterways. I really wanted to create something that would speak to sort of an integration of all of these things, because they're important to the way that we see the landscapes and the way that we would gather food, the way that our trade routes were enacted on the landscape. The majority of the major highways here in Southern California are actually over original trade routes for tribal peoples. And today we also get into a lot of this land acknowledgement and whose land am I on? Everybody wants to know because it's not taught in schools. It's a huge area of ignorance in the Western education system. And I think in that ignorance, it's from denial of the original people that were here. I don't think America has come to terms with the genocidal tactics that was used on Native people in Southern California and across the United States. And the same goes for Canada. And so as we gradually get back into these things of whose land am I on, how do I do a land acknowledgement, how do I represent those things, we also dig up this continual Western mapping of where are these tribal lands, where can I draw a border? And so these things can be really problematic too, because tribal borders sometimes ebbed and flowed, like I said. Sometimes based on populations, they would shift, or based on what was available in the food that particular year, if they needed to go and gather from other spaces. I started focusing a lot on the dimensionality of landscapes as well, so mountain ranges, valleys, areas where communities would have been established because of the designated landmarks or the access to food or access to other tribal relationships, trade. And I sort of zeroed in on this petroglyph, which is the Hemet Maze Stone. It's located in Hemet, California, which is on Cahuilla territory. And it is out sort of in the middle of nowhere. It's within sort of like a valley with mountainous regions surrounding it. When I was a little kid, my dad always had a photograph of this on his wall. He was given it by an archaeology friend of his that had gone out to the site and photographed it, and I think he just gave it to my dad as a gift, but it was something that always fascinated me when I was a child. I used to trace it with my eyes and follow the lines and things. And I never really knew the significance of it. My dad didn't really know the significance of it either. He told me they had also discovered several other stones in Southern California, one of them being the Ramona stone, and that it was brought and removed from the landscape that it was found on and placed in the front yard of a museum. And he always told me this story. He really wanted to go visit the museum and just sort of like lift the stone, put it in his truck, and return it to the people. Because he was so angry that the museum had it and they were just basically ignoring it. They didn't have any information about it. It was sitting in a garden and it was just depreciating. So I had always been curious on the cardinal points on this, north, south, east, west, and if this particular stone was located in any area of significance or if it aligned in any way with our solstice or our directions. And this is something I've been sort of working on for a couple of years. I got the piece tattooed probably about 4 or 5 years ago, not knowing much of this. And then after I sort of received the tattoo, I started playing with it with maps and landscapes. And so when Miranda sort of asked me, like, oh, can you do a map? I immediately thought of these overlays and things that I had been playing around with on my computer years prior. And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity to sort of really focus on it and create something out of it. So you can see here, this is basically a Google Earth image, and I just threw it into Photoshop, and I tried to figure out directionally what angle the petroglyph was located according to north, south, east, and west. And then I was sort of enlarging it and decreasing it using the sort of the center valley where the stone is actually located, because it's surrounded by mountains in all 4 ways, and situating the center square sort of over that valley. What's really interesting too, the Hemet Maze stone, it's associated with the people from Cahuilla. And I can never speak on their ties to it, their oral histories to it. However, I can sort of view it and see how it relates to some of our oral histories and our stories. Another thing that I found in doing some of the playing around is that they're both sort of located on the latitude of the 33rd latitude line, with our sacred site of Pavugna, which is at Cal State University, Long Beach. Our creation story originates from that point, and I just found the sort of the connection to the same sort of linear horizontal line kind of interesting. So this is a sketch for the piece that I have in the show. And I really was kind of scared to show this to Miranda and the curator, because I'm like, this is such an abstract concept, And I think when they hired me to do this, they're thinking of my illustration work, which is what most people sort of know me for. And I thought when I was walking through the empty gallery, like, it would be so easy to paint a mural. It'd be so easy to draw, our traditional plants, label them, draw a map of Southern California, and I didn't want to take the easy way out, I guess. And I wanted something that was not so direct and something that spoke to the separate Native communities that would potentially be seeing seeing this piece in particular, but something that maybe they could see in the piece that maybe your average viewer wouldn't necessarily read, kind of like an Easter egg. And so I was really thinking about that and doing it for the people and the families whose basketry is in this show, and the way that it speaks to not only past misrepresentation representation of basket weavers and the lack of, education, the lack of, I think, story associated with these weavers, and hopefully speaks to where we are currently and how we can sort of move forward. So last year, before I started this project, I also got to visit Hemet for the very first time. I went out there one day. They were so kind to help me, come out here to visit the archive down below here in the museum. And then the next day, I visited the Maze Stone. So I drove out there by myself and I hiked around, and I just spent the better part of a full day out there, just sort of paying attention to the landscape, paying attention to where the stone was located, paying attention to the similarities of land that I grew up on, which is, I was born at Satwiwa in Newbury Park, California. So there's a lot of similarities between the native plants, but there's also a lot of differences. I have to say it was one of the most peaceful and beautiful days that I've had to myself out hiking that I can imagine in the last probably 10 years. And it was so quiet. So in doing this work and also being out there, I was, very aware that I was a guest on somebody else's tribal homelands. I was very aware that I am, creating this piece and using a motif that's very personal and sensitive and probably sacred to many people in the Cahuilla community. And I also reached out to several members in the Cahuilla community, just asking sort of permissions and seeing if this would be okay to do for a public show, because I didn't want to cross any lines and I didn't want to create a piece that, would make people feel uncomfortable. And I think that's important to do, even us as tribal people, when we visit other tribal homelands, is to sort of have that reciprocity with those people, and even also with the land, asking permission for the land, is it okay for me to be here and visit you? The landscape, even though this Western concept of it's green, it's plants, we can mine it, we can take from it, we can own it, we can drill it, we can do all these things to it. At the end of the day, it's a living, breathing thing, it's an entity, it's been here way longer than we have, and I try to think of myself in somebody else's home when I'm out in these spaces. A lot of the rocks up there were just really, really incredible, huge rocks, and I saw so many just shapes and things that I wanted to just draw while I was out there. But I was also thinking of some oral histories that I had read from the Cahuilla community as well while I was up there, and kind of trying to put placement with some of their stories that are available for the public. So this is just photos of the surrounding areas. I asked permission to gather some dried elderberry from a burn area as well, and brought it back. The picture on the left here is a rock cavern that's very close to the site. And when I got home, I turned some of the elderberry into a walking stick, and I was working on making some flutes and clapper sticks out of the pieces that I had gathered. And there's a very large branch that I pulled out, and I almost got bit by a German Shepherd that thought I was trespassing. But the guy called him off and I was okay, and I had a big piece of elderberry in front of me when I was gathering it. But I was hollowing it out to do a project with, and the light went through this crack that was on the outside. And so I have this series of photographs that I took, and the photograph on the right is actually within the inner matrix of the elderberry branch, which many people think is just sort of a tube. They think it's like a hollow pulp thing, and this piece was just so gnarled and beautiful. And it really started making me think about micro landscapes too, like what's inside of these plants on a cellular level, that sort of inform where we are, who we are, how we interact with these things, and how they're interacting and reacting to us, taking from them. It almost looks like human tissue to me, and I thought it was really, really fascinating. It was like a natural kaleidoscope, and I think there is even like a termite hole on the inside or something, but it just goes to speak about home, about, even if we think it's a piece of dead, dried out wood that wasn't a fire, that potentially there's living things making a house inside of it, and we don't know how long they've been there. And so for this piece, I chose to do it with fabric material. It's done on a large, I believe it's 9 feet by 9 feet section piece of Melton wool. It has wool batting in it to give it dimensionality. And I'm also a spinner, so the yarn that's used in this piece is hand-spun churro yarn, which was hand-dyed with black walnut, I believe. Because of the size of the piece, I had to work outside. I have a cement patio in my backyard, and so most days doing the work on this piece, because my living room wasn't big enough, I'd roll it outside and hope that I didn't get sunburnt and work for hours out there. But it was really kind of peaceful too. I mean, I was forced to work, 2-3 hours at a time just doing one particular area. It was very slow process work. And it really made me think about how we kind of need to slow down with our art practice too. Everything that we do today, if I would have done this like on a computer or done like an illustration of a map, it's so regimented from me drawing it out to pencil, scanning it into a computer, putting a digital color or painting colors onto it. And it's this process, and I don't always think about time or slowing that time down while I'm working on the piece. And I think that's something that we should really be mindful of. So the map that's on here, I mixed together black walnut and elderberry stem, and I literally hand pecked it with a rock, a stone tool, into the wool. Melton wool, just by nature and the way that it's manufactured, is almost sort of waterproof, so it's really hard to get dye into. It doesn't easily absorb dye. So it's not something that I could have gone and easily just sort of painted on or used like a sponge or anything like that. I literally had to break sort of the finish on the surface of the wool in order to get the dye to sink into it. This is a piece when I was working into the evening, and it's just sort of natural evening light and sort of the raised texture of the piece. I was trying to hopefully make it look like mountain ranges and the landscape that I was trying to sort of mimic through the stitches and through the sewing and stuff. I also included the Channel Islands. Those are our traditional homelands, island of Pimu, Catalina Island. So that's also in there with a little bit of raised topography. There's a machine stitch in the water of the ocean, and I pulled a water pattern off of a basketry design and tried to incorporate that into the water. And so I asked, while I was working on this piece, what are the inherent layers of relationship in who we are? How does the location of the Hemet Maize Stone affect me or relate to me? How do the tribal lands that I was representing relate to me? Do I visit them? Do I, regularly make a point to go and see them like I would a relative? And also those surrounding areas that I haven't visited. Those are sort of blank areas on the map, but am I going to have relationships with those areas as well? And I hope sort of the coming off point and people see this piece is to ask themselves how they can interact in sort of a more informed physical space as continuation for their learning, for their growth, and also sort of day-to-day skill of just being aware of where you're at, not just saying a land acknowledgement or recognizing that tribal community. What is it on your day-to-day? Do you recognize the traditional plants that are on these landscapes? Do you understand, the history of the people that lived here? And I think that's something that they should really be teaching in schools to build compassion and get out of this place of denial of genocide for Native communities. And I think that would also reflect and force people to collaborate with Native communities today, which I think is so important. We're not all dead and gone. We are still here. Many of us are mixed, and we carry a lot of baggage from being mixed, but we're still here, and we're still trying to represent our communities in the best way possible.
Towards the end, we'll open the floor for Claremont student to ask questions if they would like. But one thing I was wondering as you were talking, and I know you mentioned this already, was you went to the Hemet Maidstone, but did you go to other locations during your process that really informed your piece or your practice?
I actually drove around San Jacinto. So in going to Hemet, you kind of have to take these roads that sort of surround the area, and it's sort of a long-winded way to get to the place that I wanted to visit. Unfortunately, I didn't have a whole lot of time to get out of the car and walk around and interact with those spaces, but I really took note of where I was. I'm very if I visit a place, I'm very observant of the spaces that I am, and I create a mental map. I went to Europe and I did that, and I was with a group of girls, and the girls panicked because they started getting lost. They're like, "Oh my God, where are we? Where's the hotel?" And I'm like, "Well, we just walked 2 blocks this way." And in my head, I think that way. And so when I drive places I've never been before, I think that way too, especially if there's natural landscapes. So it's a place I would love to go back to. I think it's beautiful. It's so different from where I live now. There's a lot less houses, a lot more open natural spaces, which reminds me of where I was born. So
Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Your family background and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I was born at the, I guess it's a Native Cultural Center now, is what they call it. It's called Satwiwa. It's in Newbury Park. My dad was brought in by the Park Service and by some Native community groups, which were based a little bit farther south back in the early 80s, to start this cultural center that would hopefully represent sort of a joint collaboration with representation of the Chumash people, which tribal land the center is actually situated on. But the Santa Monica Mountains is sort of joint territory between Gabrielino Tongva as well as Chumash people. So my dad started the center back in, I believe, 81. I was born in the house back there, home birth. My dad delivered me in 1984, and I lived there until 1989. It was a really beautiful place to grow up. My dad experienced a lot of racism, a lot of national park oversight, and it sort of climaxed into the reason that we ended up leaving the place. They weren't respectful of him holding ceremony with other tribal communities. They didn't want to allow him to sort of build it in the way that he wanted to. They wanted a lot of oversight. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stories in regards to it that I don't know, but it was sad to leave it. He doesn't go back. I go back and visit because it's the place I was born. I could draw those hills from memory. I know those hills like the back of my hand, and I miss them so much, living in the city. I think that was the biggest shocker of my life when we moved from open national park land with no neighbors, no houses, nothing. We were a single house out in the middle of nowhere, to a city where there's houses on all sides and all the roads were paved. I grew up with dirt roads. So it was a huge shock to my system, and it still makes me really sad. I mean, I would love to just move right back into the house and just live up there. But, such as things, and I'm happy that they have more financial support now and that they are still running a cultural center, because I think that's really, really important to share with the community, Native communities, as well as, the grander population in Newbury Park and LA County, who just are either ignorant or just don't know how populated those hills were with communities prior to everything.
I'm not familiar with that, and I'm wondering, are there things around Los Angeles that are distinctly a Tongva perspective, or that just have been completely forgotten about from a colonial perspective?
I think most places in LA have just been built over. I mean, the Hollywood Hills I speak about a lot with an art piece that I did, and those hills used to be a village site. They were, cleaned out in the 1800s. The native people were brought to ranchos, and then in the 1920s, it was a temporary sort of a housing thing to put up a Hollywood land sign. It was only supposed to be up for a couple of months. It was supposed to be completely temporary, and it was basically to get the major population to move sort of to the outskirts and populate, gentrification. And in doing so, they took over all of those sites with complete disregard, I'm sure. I mean, most of these places, they either get built on with infrastructure and housing, or they get drilled into to, like Long Beach. If you've ever seen historic photos of Long Beach with all of the oil piers, Signal Hill was very close to one of our sacred sites of Pavugna. And I would have loved to have been able to see that hill without oil derelicts completely covering it. And they must have done so much damage to whatever remains or archaeological materials or burials that were potentially there by putting all those things in. And because that was prior to any sort of archaeology restrictions or laws, it was all done, and all that damage can never be undone, and everything that was maybe destroyed during that time period can never be brought back or found. You know, it's like completely razing an area, and then 100 years later, oh yeah, we have Nagpra now, you know, like. So I feel like our tribal communities really got hit hard with that, and so it's been waves and waves and waves, and only until the last maybe 50 years that we've had people, you know, like my aunt working in Nagpra, helping to head reburials and also to stop damaging like archaeological spaces if they find burials when they're building freeways or if they're knocking down houses and things. So it's a lot of work, and I think Southern California communities and our community especially have been hard hit with that, and there's kind of no going back once it's been that damaged.
And is that all, like all of those things that I know, we've talked about this, but like, how does your anger and your frustration with all of that reality fuel your work and the direction that you take?
I think it definitely fuels my work. I think it probably keeps me from being very depressed or sad or very angry about all of these things. I grew up and I saw my dad and his very angry reactions to a lot of these things. And he was also an artist as well, but he never quite put his feelings towards all of these things into his art. He hadn't quite finessed that. And I feel like for a very long time I used art as my own sort of personal therapy in dealing with these things. And only recently I've sort of been able to present art in a positive educational way where it's not coming from a place of hurt and pain and anger in so much as it is, I also want people to understand there's beautiful things that came from our culture, and there's so many people in our community that have worked so tirelessly and without any sort of representation or acknowledgement for generations, like for the last 10, 20, 30 years, protecting these sites, protecting our ancestors, helping with reburial, and nobody ever says thanks or anything to any of them. And I want the work to show that, like, I couldn't do this without them sort of paving the way for me to do this by working through all of those emotions and that anger and sadness and just hard work. So,
do you ever get pushback from people, or like it's too angry or it's too aggressive?
I haven't with my own work, no. I think people are pretty understanding. I think sometimes I do, you know, make people mad. I think sometimes people maybe want to put their own sort of methodologies forward or their ideas forward, but they're not doing so in sort of I guess a neutral, a space or a place of like trying to make people understand. I like to say compassion because that sort of sums up all of the sort of feelings that I hope that my art can sort of carry forth and leave all the emotional baggage behind. Not saying that I don't deal with that while I'm working on the pieces, because oftentimes I do, especially with this piece. There's a lot of like thought and stuff that I don't talk about that went into this piece as well. But I don't want the piece to speak on those things. I don't want that energy and that hurt and everything to carry forth into the art. I want something positive to come out of it.
And I really love that. Thank you for saying that, because I think it really relates to maybe not always understanding the full breadth of what the Hemet Stone is either. So you're adding another layer to not everything is for you when we're doing this work. So like that extension, I think is super important. I will kind of segue because I think it's important. You are a basket weaver as well, or attempting.
I'm learning. I wouldn't call myself one.
Well, I know that you do. How about this? I know that you work on...
I'm in progress. So.
Yes, there you go. I know that you work a lot on like going through online auctions and finding pieces, like basket pieces on these sites to see like if you can identify where they came from and give them back, like you gave something back to Gerald Clark if you wanted to share that story. But how has that, because I know we've also worked on another basket show together, how does the work with baskets influence what you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like I started thinking about this after the last couple of years, like coming here and seeing the archives and also attending one of the workshops and meeting some of the Cahuilla Basket Weavers, Roseanne Hamilton, Lori Sisquock, and when I was very small, I have this memory where I went out to the beach and we had this dune grass growing and stuff, and I gathered a bunch of dune grass and I wove this little tiny basket, and my parents' neighbors down the street had like a going away party. They had sold their house, they were moving to the other side of the country. I didn't even know them, but I gave them the basket that I wove, and I remember she was really happy about it, and I just like, I wish I had a picture of it, but that's like a memory. And so I guess like I have always had sort of an interest in creating baskets and weavings and textiles. However, I've never really been formally trained. And I've worked with like seagrass. My hands are always wanting to do things. And so I'm now sort of learning, things that have, been lost for very many years, sort of the styles of weaving that our tribal people would have done, the materials and gathering and collecting materials. So there's this whole, process side to it before you even get to weave. And it's way more extensive, I think, than the actual weaving process. So, I've been very fortunate to have like Lori Sisquock, have Tima Link reach out to me and share some of the knowledge that they have. And I think really that's the way that we sort of revitalize these things, because we can't do it alone. We can't do it alone within our communities. We kind of have to like reach out and interact with these other communities that surround us and, respectfully, like, can you please show me how to do this? Or, if they're willing to sort of share those things with us. I think that's the only way that we're going to learn back everything that we've lost. I think I tangented from your question too.
Okay, it's okay. Your auctions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess in trying to understand all the techniques for our weaving, as well as how other tribal communities do those things, and also the difference between our materials, which are predominantly junkus and deergrass, to other materials from other tribal communities, such as redbud up north or bracken fern. I started looking online, and because there's only so many books you can get, and I have all of them at the house, I started looking at auction catalogs, because they get a lot of baskets, and oftentimes they're misidentified. In fact, I would say probably about 75% of the time, they have the wrong information, the wrong tribal affiliation on those baskets, and that just sort of broke open this entire really painful sort of realization that like antique stores, there's auction houses around the country that have regular auctions on a weekly basis. There's probably like 10 to 20 auctions, just on live auctioneers, and they just flip baskets. And wouldn't you know, the Chumash and the Tongva are usually the ones that are the hardest to obtain. They go for the most money, and they oftentimes are bought by collectors sort of on this black market. So once they sort of pop up, they get bought and disappear again for another 10, 15 years, or until that person dies. So I started trying to identify our baskets and figure out, what our materials are, what are the distinguishing factors. So if they do come up, maybe I can bring some of them back to the community, because I don't think it's fair that they're stored in people's houses in this way and seen as commodities and seen as high value items when they're so meaningful and so rare to our own communities. And it wasn't until I started doing this work just in the last couple of years that I got to see our first like Tongva basket I'd ever seen in my life at the Autry Museum. I had only ever seen pictures of our weavings before, and so that was really meaningful. And I'm really grateful for museums like the Benton too that have opened up their collections to the communities, because you can't even understand what type of healing that is for our people to be able to see these and hold these, especially if there's documentation of the family members like they have here. It's so important, and it also aids us in the revitalization process.
trying to think of one other question. What was the best part of working on this?
I think being allowed to sit outside on my backyard and just work for hours and get into this really sort of meditative process of, I mean, it was kind of hard work beating that into the wool. I had like this rock in my hand, I was really tired, and I just kept thinking, like, I wonder how long whoever did the stone took to do it. I wonder if they worked like in pieces and they came back to it. I wonder if they sat there until it was finished. And I was really curious. I started thinking, like, what were they thinking while they were doing it? Like, what were they trying to communicate? What story were they trying to tell, you know, for their community? And I really hope that it sort of does justice to that stone, because it's a beautiful piece of art in itself. It's a very meaningful piece of art to their community, and the landscape around it is just really, really beautiful as well.
Can you speak about the waterway, like how you got that edging?
Yeah, so I used a sewing machine for the sort of the water design in the water. I wanted something to contrast. Everything else is hand stitched with a needle and thread and hands. That's the only mechanical process in the whole piece. And it actually fought me the entire time I was doing it, because it wanted to pull the material and like crease it in ways that it wasn't supposed to. And I ended up unpicking it all the first time around, and then I had to redo it all. But it's taken from the Catherine Siva Salvel word book. She has sort of basketry designs in there. So it'd be par in our language. It's just water. It's just a water design, and it's frequent and common in Southern California basketry. You'll see the motif sort of repeated amongst different tribal communities.
And my final question before I open it up to the group is, what's something I just lost? Waiting it out. What is, I guess after everything we're talking about, and landscape and water and all of these great things is, and I know you've talked about this in your talk, but I wonder if you want to expand on it, is just how do people become more informed about the physical space that they're in a respectful way, right? In a way that doesn't extract or appropriate. And that's a huge question that I'm sorry my brain just decided to ask you.
Almost, but not quite. Wow, that's a loaded question.
You're welcome.
I think people need to be more grateful for basic human needs and realize that, realize that this Western world is sort of built on capitalizing off of everything that we would normally need in our lives and all of these excess things that we don't need. And I think, I'm staring at the water, and I always think about what my aunt says, it's always about the water. So your basic needs are food, shelter, and water. And then, you know, I guess to be happy, you have community. And so many of these distractions that we have in our lives, from, you know, trendy, like, hiking apps, to iNaturalist, to whose land do you live on, to the trendy wildflower blooming Instagram pictures, all of those things. That's all nature, right? It's all tribal lands. Do we need those things to enjoy the spaces around us? Do we need REI backpacks and hats that say you are on native land to realize that we're on native land? And I'm not, you know, putting those things down, but like, I think it's really important to get down to the basics of things.
You're not wrong, yes.
Because, okay, if you follow me on Instagram, I'm a real stickler of like where things are manufactured as well. What is this country based on? It's based on exported manufacturing. Exportation of manufactured goods causes really harmful effects to landscapes, to people in other countries. Before, we used to do it here, and we hurt people of color. We used to hire the Chinese to do work. We used to hire African Americans to do work, Mexicans, Native Americans, right? oftentimes, or even if it was poor Caucasian people, they were the laborers, the farmers, the people that made the things that we need. And so I think from a very basic level, you need to ask yourself, what are my most basic needs? Do I need all these excessive things? And when I spend my money or put my, my finances into something, is it harming something? Is it doing more harm for no reason? Is it, putting harm on imported hats made in China because it's easier for me to spend $40 on that than it is to go and grow my own sage at home, or go and devote some time at like a nursery or help plant native plants or something like that. So I mean, no dig at people, because I myself have done merchandise and things to get people to understand. And I really kind of took a step back a couple of years ago and I said, what am I doing? People are getting these things and they're happy to support me, but how are these sites that are selling these things, where are they getting their goods? How is that having a larger impact on everything? And so I think the more that I think about that, the more I'm sort of pulling back and minimizing my thoughts on what do I need and how can I put that time and effort into the most important thing, which is my art, which is a reflection of my viewpoints. And just getting people to think a little bit more about their actions and their day-to-day living.
Yeah.
That's a really long...
No, but that's a great answer. That was beautiful. Thank you. If there's any Claremont students or even faculty or staff, any of the are here to ask some questions, that'd be great. Anyone want to ask any question? Yes, Josh.
No, I can speak. Okay. What are some of the other artists, native or not, that have influenced you in your development as an artist throughout your life?
I'll have to say there weren't a lot of native artists with me growing up. I think my dad had a poster of a coyote in a leather jacket in our garage darkroom when I was a kid, and I never knew who did it, but now, knowing it's like a native artist. But there wasn't a lot of representation. I grew up reading French, heavy metal comics. I really love Art Nouveau. I love Craftsman era stuff and arts and crafts movement, and there's a whole sort of thought process that goes behind that. And even now today, despite the fact that arts and crafts houses like we have here in Pasadena probably contributed massively to the deforestation of our local, trees, they're beautiful things. I love oak wood, I love oak furniture. So yeah, I had a lot of outside influence, I think. I think mainly it's Art Nouveau and early 19th century illustration was a huge impact to the work that I do, and that's just sort of my illustration work. Now that I'm venturing into these new spaces, I'm learning about more artists and learning about more abstraction on ways to communicate ideas, and I can't say I have a favorite or one particular person that I look up to right now. I'm still trying to figure out what it is that I do. I'm so well known for illustration, but there's so many other things that I would like to get my hands into and communicate ideas with.
I don't need a mic. Okay. I remember talking to your dad years ago, and he loved music. I remember we had the same love for a band. Yes.
Yes.
And I wanted to know, does music influence you?
Oh, greatly. So I laugh about that because, honestly, I would probably rather be a musician than a fine artist. But the way my brain works, I tried picking up guitar as a kid, and I asked my dad, "Oh, Dad, can I get a guitar? I really love this. I get so." It's almost like a euphoric thing, good music to me, and it creates a state of euphoria. So I always have music playing when I'm working, but I am a terrible musician. My brain doesn't pick up patterns. I can't read music to save my life. I've taken classes, I've tried to learn, and it's really difficult for me. And yeah, so my brothers are all really good at guitar, and they got that. I like to fix instruments. I play banjo really bad. I dabble in ukulele and like weird sort of folk, European folk instruments. I'm sort of more interested in antique instruments. But luckily with those, nobody really knows what they sound like, so you can do whatever, and it's great.
Were you listening to anything while making this? Or any of your...
You know, I was listening to bird songs.
Oh.
Yeah. I have some saved on my phone, and I just thought that might be appropriate to listen to while I was working on this, and it just kind of put me in a nice headspace, so.
Awesome. Other questions? I mean, there's not... Yes, Victoria. I've been told I need to
I'm here. Oh, okay. I just would love to, and thank you so much. I mean, I could listen to you for 7 more hours. We won't keep you here, but this is so, I mean, I've had the honor of living with this work, and now my relationship is that much deeper. So thank you so much. And I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about the colorways in the piece. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, oh, this is so poetic that you're really provoking us to be slower and more intentional, and the colorway of your piece is very subtle, but it occurs to me, especially when you start with these more conventional Western maps that can be, you know, really contrasting colors, or, you know, the thread that you chose is quiet, for example, and you're using natural pigments that end up kind of having a quiet effect, which I'm now really appreciating how perfect that is. But could you just say a little bit more about the colorways that you chose?
Yeah, so the wool Melton is, I believe, undyed, although I may be incorrect on that. So it's natural color of wool that I could possibly get. You know, so I'm also restricted by materials. I had to purchase the wool. I had to, you know, I couldn't weave it from the ground up, unfortunately. And so I tried to find something that was as natural as possible. I thought about doing it in reverse too, because of the way that the actual maize stone is done, where it's sort of, you know, a lighter tone on a darker tone. But for some reason, just sort of like a really calm, non-intrusive, I guess, neutral thing was the way to go with this. I didn't want people to walk in and be like, ooh, color. I didn't want to take anything away from the basketry. I'm very aware of the way that they dye the materials for the baskets, and the materials that they use to create those dyes, and how long it takes for juncus to be dyed. And so I was also thinking about those things. You know, we use elderberry, we use the black walnut, we use oak galls for our dyes for baskets, as well as like iron mordants. So depending on, you know, if you can go and do it sort of near a creek and do it naturally and leave your juncus sitting in mud, which most of us can't sort of do, or if you have a bucket at home and you make the dye yourself. But most important to me was not to use synthetic dyes. I wanted sort of the subtlety of not being able to control the way the black walnut's gonna sort of build up and layer. Like you can see certain areas in it that are lighter or darker when you see the actual piece. And that has to do with, I was using elderberry branches, small ones, and I sort of smashed them with a rock so they were almost like a brush, like a fiber. And then after doing it for so many hours, I literally had a ball of sort of this fiber material in my hand, and I would dip it into the ink, and then I would lay it on the thing and then pound it with the rock. So it would sort of work almost like a sponge to hold the stuff, but it also has its own dye in it. If you've ever worked with elderberry, like your fingers will turn green and brown, and it's really hard to get off. But so yeah, my hands were covered in it. But just to speak of those things, and to speak of, you know, they have black walnut trees down in Cahuilla territory, just like they have up in Chumash territory on our lands. Same thing with elderberry. We share a lot of the same plants and using the plants for the same things. And so I was hoping in my choice of dye materials that it would also speak to that on sort of a different level. I don't know how color fast these things are, so it was also an experiment for me. I don't know, like, if in 5 to 10 years, if the dyes are going to still be as vibrant, or if they're going to oxidize and go darker or lighter. But that's, I guess, all sort of the unknown that you do when you sort of work with more natural materials.
Oh, one more. I can talk loud too. I'm I'm a teacher, a local teacher, and I belong to the Teachers Union, and we've started an equity committee. And so we're starting with the land acknowledgement and where the California Teachers Association is doing. But I want to move past that, and you spoke about that today. And our members, we have some of our board members who are pushing back against even doing the land acknowledgement. And it's super frustrating for me, as I'm a tribal member as well, not from California, but, you know, I just don't know what to do to push past the land acknowledgement, and I really feel that we need to grow and move past that as, you know, citizens of the land of these people. Any ideas?
Yeah. I actually have experience in this area. I know teachers, and I know how hard it is to get these things into the state curriculum, because especially like with federally unrecognized tribes like our tribe, the state money for Indian education is not there. I was asked to speak up in...
I'm just talking about my union members. I'm not even talking about kids.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, it's like, I would maybe seek out artists or authors or somebody that's making something currently that's something you can go and support, you know, the makers, whether it's a children's book or whether it's an educational book or, you know, a film, a documentary, something that's being made by tribal community members from the land that you're teaching on, and bring those to the table and be like, look, so if you don't want to acknowledge, you know, that these people were on their land, that we took their land or whatever, if there's guilt or denial in that, this is what they're doing now. Many people are trying to re-educate in positive ways through either educational materials, through books, through poetry, and, you know, they're happy to have those books and things incorporated in curriculum, whether it's in a classroom setting or whether it's in a greater state curriculum. Now, I'm sure, as you know, as a teacher, it's much harder to sort of make change from the inside out. And that's a huge thing here in the state of California, like I said, because they don't want to apply state money to federally unrecognized tribes. And California probably has the largest percentage of federally unrecognized tribal communities that were also displaced off their lands. So I've tried to work within school districts, and there's so much red tape because they're like, oh, well, we have this grant, but we can't give it to you because you're not federally recognized. We can give it to these other people, and you can write something for them, and then they can share it, you know? So there's so many, like, just problematic things going on in state-mandated education. So if there's something that you can do to support people directly from those tribal communities, like immediately, there's book lists online that you can access for children's books. There's also middle grade novel books and adult fiction and adult, you know, nonfiction as well, where you can support authors from these tribal communities and just bring their work to the table. In most cases, they're either talking about stories from their tribes, they're talking about, you know, real live sort of social, economical, like politics going on in the communities today through their work. And I think that's probably the best way to just make people realize that we're not just like dead and gone and we need to acknowledge their land, you know, because I think there's a disconnect. People don't understand that, you know, there could be people when you go grocery shopping that are tribal community members and you just don't know. So support artists, I guess, in any way, shape, and form in what they're doing. And I think, you know, artists, a lot of the time, especially in tribal communities, we're trying to sort of do that work to make it easier for people to connect.
I liked your idea of the creation stories. And bring those to people that don't know. I mean, I like creation stories.
That can be problematic too, though, because I mean, there's tribal communities that don't even know their creation stories. It's been taken away, and there's nobody within, you know, a small radius where they can go to learn those things. So you have to also understand that there's a lot of disconnected tribal people, and they don't even know things about their own tribal people, and they're relearning these things when they can. So I don't always feel that, you know, as much as people love to hear creation stories from different things, and it's a selling point for books and things, I feel like it's also kind of like Miranda was kind of saying, not for everybody. It's community-based, and the public doesn't need to know about all of those things. And sometimes we need to be respectful about that and let people have their space to heal and to reconnect with those things and sort of rebuild, their worldview before outsiders come in and start sharing those things or becoming experts on those things.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. The galleries are open at 9 p.m. 10, I'm sorry. Really quick, you cannot touch the baskets. If there are Cahuilla descendants here who would like to arrange for that, we can definitely do that. But for tonight, we're asking that everyone not touch or, pick them up, unless you talk to one of us ahead of time, just so that our security doesn't get freaked out. But that's it. So thank you everyone. Let's thank Weshoyot for being here.